Would Europe have a chance to stand up to the United States of America? Just a few years ago, such a question would have sounded absurd. The United States was the guarantor of security, NATO's pillar, and Western stability's foundation. A conflict between Europe and the United States was considered an impossible scenario, one that simply wasn't contemplated. But the last few months have disrupted this assumption. The dispute over Greenland, open pressure ultimatums, and language that until then had been used exclusively towards rivals, not towards allies. Suddenly an uncomfortable but legitimate question arises. What would happen if the interests of Europe and the United States of America came into direct conflict? Not in theory, but in reality. This video is not looking for sensation or scenario of war. It is looking for an answer to what the real balance of power is and what illusions the West has maintained for years. What does it mean to oppose the United States of America? Standing up to the United States does not mean declaring war or sending armies against each other. For great powers, it's about something different. It means the ability to withstand political pressure, economic sanctions, security ultimatums, and military projection of power, which may never escalate into open conflict. Most disputes between great powers are not decided on the battlefield, but rather before it ever comes to that. In negotiations, in the economy, in control of territory, and in the ability to enforce one's will without a single shot being fired. So if we ask whether Europe would stand a chance against America, we're not asking who has more tanks. We're asking who would have the upper hand in a situation where politics, economics, military presence, and time are all mixed together. And it's in this type of conflict that the fundamental differences between what Europe is and what the United States represents begin to show. Asymmetry, not conflict. When comparing Europe and the United States, one fundamental mistake is often made. The conflict is presented as a clash between two comparable blocks. But the reality is different. It's not a symmetrical fight, but an asymmetry. The United States is a single political and military actor with unified command, quick decision-making, and global power projection. Europe is made up of dozens of states with different interests, security priorities, and political constraints. Even if they had similar military potential on paper, in practice they cannot use it as quickly or as coordinately. The United States can act immediately. Europe must first discuss, seek consensus, and negotiate internal compromises. In a situation of pressure or crisis, time becomes the decisive factor. It's not the one who has more resources, but the one who can use them sooner, who gains the upper hand. And this is where the imaginary balance begins to shift. It's not that Europe is weak. It's that it's slow, divided, and bound by its own rules. In this comparison, the United States does not appear as a stronger opponent in the classic sense, but as an actor who has a systemic advantage even before the conflict begins. The United States of America is already in Europe. The debate about whether the United States could assert itself militarily in Europe has one fundamental weakness. It is based on the idea that the United States of America would first have to enter Europe, but the United States has long been present in Europe. And not just symbolically, but physically, permanently, and systematically. There are currently about 100,000 American soldiers on the European continent, stationed in key countries from Germany and Poland to Italy, the United Kingdom, and Romania. These are units with their own command, their own logistics, and direct connection to American global structures. In this sense, Europe is not a place where the United States would have to build something from scratch. American infrastructure has existed here for decades. Bases like Ramstein in Germany, Aviano in Italy, Lakenheath in Britain, or Rota in Spain are not just military airfields. They are hubs of command, supply, and power projection. It is through them that, in a crisis situation, air operations, troop movements, and logistical support would be coordinated. The United States has deployed modern fighter jets in Europe, including the F-15, F-16, and F-35 early warning systems, refueling aircraft, and access to strategic bombers, which, although they rotate from the United States, are capable of reaching Europe within hours. This creates a reality in which the United States would have air dominance almost immediately. The nuclear factor is a separate chapter. The United States has deployed B-61 tactical nuclear weapons in several NATO member countries on European territory. Even though they are physically stored in Europe, control over them remains in the hands of Washington. Europe, as such, does not have a joint nuclear command. Only France and the United Kingdom possess nuclear weapons, and their capabilities are designed primarily for deterrence, not for waging a major conflict, and for their own main allies. This imbalance means that, in any serious security scenario, the decisive word would belong to the United States. However, the key point is that this American presence does not exist in a political vacuum. It is deployed on the territory of countries that are part of both the European Union and NATO, and that have their own political interests, internal disputes, and limitations. If Europe were to find itself in a situation where it had to stand up to the United States, it would not only be dealing with external pressure, but also with internal conflict. How to respond to a force that is already on its territory under the flag of an ally. This is where it becomes clear that the question of Europe's chances is not a hypothetical military game, but an extremely complicated political and security problem, in which Washington already has the upper hand before anything escalates. The first strike without a shot. If the interests of Europe and the United States were to come into serious conflict, the first strike would not come from military bases or from the decks of ships. It would come from the economy. This is exactly where the United States has the greatest room for quick and effective pressure, which would not require the approval of Congress, NATO, or the Allies. A decision by the White House would be enough. Tariffs, sanctions, regulations, restrictions on access to the American market. All of these are tools the United States of America has already used in the past, even against partners when they considered it advantageous. Europe is dependent on the American economy. It's tied much more deeply than it often admits. The United States controls key elements of the global financial system. The dollar is the dominant currency in world trade. American banks and financial institutions have influence far beyond the borders of the United States of America, and access to them is essential for European companies. If Washington were to use financial tools, the impact would be swift and painful. European companies would face higher costs and limited financing, uncertainty in the markets. All of this would happen even before a political response could get underway in Brussels. Europe does have its own economic bazooka. The European Union has a unified customs policy, and in recent years has adopted tools against economic coercion, which allow it to introduce extensive retaliatory measures. Tariffs worth tens of billions of euros are at stake. There could be restrictions on access for American companies to the single market or the suspension of certain trade agreements. However, the problem is not the existence of these tools, but time. Activating European mechanisms requires analyses, voting by member states, and political consensus. The United States can act immediately. Europe reacts slowly. Another weak point is the internal imbalance of impacts. American measures would not affect all European countries equally. Some economies would feel the pressure more than others. The automotive case, industry, aviation, technology, energy, that would immediately create internal tension among the member states. While part of Europe would push for a tough response, other countries would look for ways to ease tensions to protect their own economies. It is precisely at this point that an economic conflict turns into a political problem, which weakens unity. From the United States' perspective, this is a key advantage. They don't need to defeat all of Europe. It's enough for them to divide it. Economic pressure is the ideal tool because it works quickly, selectively, and without visible escalation. And that's exactly why it would be the first and most likely weapon in a potential conflict. Before any talk of military force began, Europe would already be dealing with the consequences of an economic strike that would hit it from within. Pressure without war. Security is leverage. If economic pressure wasn't enough, or if Europe started looking for ways to circumvent it, the United States has another level of pressure at its disposal. Not war, security. Europe's fundamental problem is simple. Its security architecture is still built on the United States, not formally, but practically. NATO, without the United States, is not a fully fledged military alliance, but rather a political framework. American command, intelligence, logistics, satellites, and the ability for rapid power projection are what make NATO a real security tool. The United States doesn't have to take dramatic steps in this system. They don't have to withdraw troops or cancel commitments. A subtle change in behavior is enough. A slowdown in decision-making, reluctance in planning, less willingness to bear the costs. Signals that the security guarantee is not automatic but conditional. That would be a fundamental problem for Europe, not because it would immediately face a military threat, but because it would find itself in strategic uncertainty. Every country would have to ask itself, can we really rely on the United States in a crisis situation? And if not, what does that mean for our decisions today? Such uncertainty has concrete consequences. Countries on the eastern flank would push to maintain the closest possible ties with Washington at any cost. Other states would try to ease the conflict with the United States so as not to jeopardize their own security. The result would not be a unified European position, but the breakdown of a common stance. The United States wouldn't even have to issue a single ultimatum. It would be enough to let Europe have doubts. In security policy, doubt is often stronger than an open threat. At the same time, it should be added that Europe doesn't have a quick replacement. Building its own defense capabilities takes years, not months. Own command, joint planning, interoperability, strategic transport, satellite systems. These are all areas where Europe has gaps that cannot be filled by a political statement. And this is exactly where the core of the problem shows. Europe may have economic strength, technological potential, and huge resources, but in terms of security, it is still dependent, and dependence turns into leverage in a conflict. The United States wouldn't have to defeat Europe economically or militarily. It would be enough for them to maintain a situation where Europe isn't sure if it can afford to go against Washington's will. In such an environment, making fundamental decisions is very difficult. Why would Europe back down? In a hypothetical conflict with the United States, Europe wouldn't be facing a question of courage, but a question of cost. This is where the scenario takes a definitive turn. Not because Europe wouldn't have options for resistance, but because the costs of confrontation would be immediate, unevenly distributed, and politically hard to sustain. Europe operates on consensus. That's its strength in times of peace, but in crises, it turns into a weakness. Every fundamental decision requires the agreement of states that have different historical experiences, economic ties, and security concerns. In a situation of pressure, there wouldn't be a single European response, but several parallel strategies. Some countries would be willing to go into confrontation while others would try to freeze or bypass the conflict. The United States doesn't have to create this contradiction. It would be enough to just let it manifest itself. The moment Europe failed to agree on a unified approach, the pressure would automatically shift from an external conflict to an internal dispute. And an internal dispute is always more dangerous for Europe than an external opponent. We need to realize one more thing. The United States would not be risking its existence in such a scenario. For Washington, it would be a duty, the pursuit of interests. For Europe, it would be about the stability of the system on which it is built. Political elites would very quickly face the question of whether it makes sense to escalate the conflict, and the results could be a weakened economy, insecurity in terms of safety, and growing internal tension. And this is exactly where pragmatism is born, not ideological but political. Most European governments would rather look for a way to reach an agreement than to engage in open conflict, not because the United States has absolute power, but because Europe would not have a strong enough common reason to go all the way to the edge. That doesn't mean capitulation. Rather, it would be a quiet retreat, compromises, rephrasing positions, shifting red lines, exactly as it happens most often in international politics. without dramatic gestures, without declarations of defeat, but with a clear result. At this point, the harsh reality becomes clear. Europe would not lose a war in such a conflict. It would try to avoid it, and the United States would know that. There is a chance, but not today. The question of whether Europe would have a chance to stand up to the United States does not have a simple answer. Not because it's hypothetical, but because the answer depends on timing. In the short term, Europe would not have the upper hand. Not militarily, not politically, and not systemically. The United States has results, the advantage of quick decision-making, unified command, economic leverage, and security dominance. Europe would face the pressure of dispersed power, internal disputes, and asymmetric impacts that would weaken it from within even before it could act in unity. However, this does not mean that Europe is powerless. In the medium and long term, Europe has the potential to become an independent geopolitical actor. It has economic strength comparable to the United States, technological capabilities, demographic weight, and an industrial base. What it lacks is not resources, but political will, speed of decision-making, and true strategic autonomy. The crisis around Greenland is therefore not just a territorial dispute, it's a warning. It shows that the West is no longer automatically united and that American protection is not unconditional. It raises questions that Europe has postponed for many years. Who protects it? Who decides about its security? And what is it willing to sacrifice if the interests of its allies diverge? Therefore, the most likely scenario is not a military confrontation. It is pressure, compromises, and gradual adaptation to a new reality in which the United States acts more assertively and Europe is forced to react faster than it was used to. If Europe is ever to have a real chance to stand up to the United States, it won't be on the battlefield. It will depend on whether it can act as one, respond quickly, and bear the consequences of its own decisions. Until that happens, a conflict with the United States of America will remain more a test of European maturity than a real clash of great powers. And that is the most important lesson of this whole dispute.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a tip. And if you want to help the video reach more people, click on share. I appreciate it.